Good afternoon, all. My name is Nermeen Shaikh. I'm a co-host and senior producer at the independent television news hour, Democracy Now!, based in New York, though we broadcast globally. I'd just like to begin by thanking Arjun and Olivia for that very moving conversation and performance right now. And before I begin, just to say, just like in the last panel, we'll speak for about 50 minutes to an hour, and after that we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. You all have note cards. Please use them to write succinct, short, clear questions. And if you'd like the questions addressed to a specific speaker, please say so, and people will come around the aisles and hand them to me after we're done the first hour. So let me begin first by introducing our distinguished panel. Immediately to my left, Ranjit Hoskote, Indian poet and curator. His most recent collection of poetry is titled Ice Light. His translation of a 14th century Kashmiri woman's mystic poetry is called Ay Lalla, the poems of Lal Ded. His translation of the 18th century Urdu poet, Mir Taqi Mir, is forthcoming as The Homelands and Ocean. He's curated more than 50 exhibitions, including India's first national pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Nesrine Malik, 2 seats away from me, is an award-winning British-Sudanese author and journalist whose work focuses on race, identity, politics, and international affairs. She's the author of We Need New Stories, challenging the toxic myths behind our age of discontent. She has columns in leading outlets, including The Guardian and The New York Times, and I have been reading her, and I'm sure many of you, for years. Branko Milanovic, at the end of the panel, is a research professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. His most recent books are Visions of Inequality, From the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War, and Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World. And finally, Kohei Saito is a philosophy professor at the University of Tokyo and a leading contemporary Marxist thinker. His most recent book is Capital in the Anthropocene, which has sold more than 500,000 copies in Japan and was published in English as Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. It came out just earlier this year here. So before we begin our conversation, I'll just make a few brief preliminary remarks enumerating very schematically the principal and often intersecting vectors of social inequality, which will help us orient our discussion. To state the obvious, social inequality encompasses far more than economic inequality, though this may be the form with which we're most familiar. That is the inequality of wealth and means, its formal, quantifiable aspects, to which the findings in a succession of Oxfam reports testify. This is one axis. Race and gender are others, class and cultural capital others still. The relationship between these categories within heterogeneous societies in the North, though of course not all societies in the North are heterogeneous, the relationship between these categories is clear to some and not so clear to others. In the US, there remains some hesitation in speaking of class inequality, but the necessity to point to this phenomenon, especially in the wake of Zuccotti Park and the 1%, led to the more narrow framing of economic inequality. Narrow because a lack of privilege in one domain does not uniformly correspond to a lack in another, if one can even use a term as ambiguous and contested as privilege in this context. Global social inequality takes other forms as well. It's impossible not to mention the most visible at the moment, which the previous panelists also spoke about, the murderous assault on Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands, mostly children and women, which of course no atrocity could justify. Would such a massacre be permissible in broad daylight, broadcast literally in real time to all of us? Would such a massacre be permissible in the case of all lives everywhere? So there is then the inequality in the value of life itself, made even more acute given the deaths that scarcely appear worthy of mention. This is something that Nesrine has written about. The ongoing war in Sudan is another contemporary instance, to say nothing of the millions killed in the wars in Ethiopia and Congo. And clearly the loss of a life should not be the moment in which its value is determined. Inequality is laid bare too in the most urgent crisis of our time, the climate catastrophe, to which we are all increasingly witness. There's the obvious discrepancy, historic and in most instances persistent, between countries. The most spectacular, perhaps this, that the US is responsible for about 14% of global emissions, while countries of substantial populations, minimally Indonesia, contributes less than 1.5%, and Pakistan 0.5%. There is, too, a breathtaking inequality between the rich and poor around the world. The world's richest 1% are responsible for around the same percentage of global carbon emissions as the poorest 66%. That's about 5 billion people. It should be noted here, too, that although people in the North comprise the majority of wealthy people in the world, or to use Branko's more precise term, the globally affluent, billionaires today, that is, the richest, are no longer concentrated in the global North alone. The majority reside not in London or New York, but are distributed across cities in China, India, and Russia. And finally, and relatedly, there's the matter of global political inequality, the gradual weakening of a so-called unipolar world with the US at its head. What new formations are emerging? What are its features? And what might such developments portend for countries historically less dominant? If power comes to be shared, no doubt unequally, from China to the United Arab Emirates, Russia to Qatar, what new possibilities or indeed dangers may arise? So with those brief remarks, I'd like to begin with Branko, who has devoted a lot of his life's work to the question of inequality. So Branko, if you could just begin by talking about your new book in which you track the transformations of the phenomenon of inequality. So if you could just start by defining what do you mean by inequality and in what senses has its manifestation changed from, over time?
Well, thank you very much. First, thank you very much for inviting me. It's obviously a pleasure to be here. I didn't have to walk very far because I was in Washington anyway, but it's still. It's very good, thank you very much for having me start, and I will be relatively brief. You mentioned before the issue of class. And when I started writing the book, which looks at how major thinkers or economists have thought about income inequality, I did not have an a priori vision like which way it would go, because these are people whom I've been reading for a long time, but I didn't put them together, actually. And I started with Quesnay, which is a French economist, was maybe the founder of political economy, before the revolution, French Revolution. Then go with Adam Smith, predictably, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Pareto, and Kuznets. And then I come to post-World War II economics or perception of inequality, mostly in the West, but also in socialist countries. And one thing which struck me is that the definition of what is like the salient feature that people sort of look at when you look at inequality starts with legally defined classes before the French Revolution, then goes in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, to the ownership of the means of production. So basically we have landowners, capitalists, and workers. Then comes to Pareto, who actually gets rid of classes, and he says we have an elite, which will be in different systems, but there will be always an elite, and there will be everybody else. Of course, that resonates very much with the top 1% now. And then we come to Kuznets, who actually sees the main gap and the main cleavage between agriculture and manufacturing, between rural and urban areas. And then, that's most interesting, I think, actually, is then we come to what I call Cold War economics. The Cold War economics totally disregard classes. And I think, and the reason why that chapter actually starts with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, is that the process whereby classes were eliminated from thinking was very similar. In those countries, they said, well, we don't have capitalists anymore, so we really have a hard time deciding there are no more classes. Everybody is the same. Everybody is state sector worker. In the US, likewise, they said, well, we don't have classes either because we are in competition with the Soviet Union. We cannot accept that we have classes. So we say we don't have classes. The economic profession moved in such a way that whether you own capital, labor, what's called own labor or whatever, it becomes really undistinguishable. It is you have asset I have asset J, and then there is asset K, which is the subscripts. So essentially everybody becomes the same. Everybody is the same agent. Class structure is eliminated, and any other cleavages are eliminated. That, of course, comes to an end in the early 21st century, and then we have now the return. First, the return of capital, which is very important because capital represents really the bulk of income of the rich. Secondly, we have, for the first time, really a big role for gender and racial inequality. So that would be my sort of a 2-century review in 6 minutes. But it will give you, I think it gives you a good idea how our perception has changed and how it was politically influenced throughout all this time.
And so Nesrine, Branko just mentioned the question of the transformation, the shift towards questions of gender and racial inequality. A lot of your work, a lot of your columns focus on these two aspects of inequality. So if you could explain within these two sites, first of all, how you came to focus on these two, and how you see these as now occupying such a massive role, a massive place in one's understanding of what equality could look like.
So it depends. There's sort of two categorizations of exclusion based on identity. There is the sort of Western categorization, which is to include marginalized groups, whether they be of color or marginalized groups based on their gender or sexual orientation, into sort of more mainstream rights and privileges. And then there is broadly a sort of non-Western, in my experience, global South, but focusing on sort of Middle East, North Africa, where marginalization or exclusion of people and their deprivation from the means of social equality is much more of a political matter, so much less aligned with the rights discourse of political change. So I'll break that down. In Egypt, Sudan, and broadly across countries that experienced the Arab Spring, there was a separation between social exclusion and political exclusion. Political exclusion was favored above social exclusion. So lack of ability to vote, lack of civil rights, the way in which people were imprisoned without trial, all these sort of human rights and civil rights questions became very central to the idea of political change. Excluded from them was any idea of marginalization that did not align with that sort of political project, right? So women's rights were not a central factor in the Arab Spring. The rights of refugees, for example, the rights of racial minorities that had not been afforded equal representation, et cetera, completely marginal to the cause of political change, and in Sudan as well, which is where I'm from. So it was a really clear example of how you can have these huge transformative political movements that feel very universal, and feel very pivotal and around which there is a lot of consensus, and they can be historic, but fundamentally exclude some very crucial components of what is needed to bring about change. We can, just to keep it brief, we can come on to the sort of doomed way that comes around later. Then there's the sort of Western discourse, which is very separate in the sense that it mimics the same exclusion of rights from what constitutes political change, but at the same time, in a very counterintuitive and very confusing way, really centers it in the discourse, right? So you can't get, there's so much discourse and conversation and agonizing around representation and diversity, around gender and particularly minority rights, people of color, since Black Lives Matter. But the way that happens is there's so much focus on it and there's so much anxiety and actually money being invested in these inclusion projects, but they are restricted to a certain space and a certain elitist sort of universe. So the way rights are discussed or seen as useful or productive or redistributive is if more people from marginalized or excluded backgrounds are brought into the spaces that afford them privilege, access to capital, access to profile, all the currency of sort of neoliberal, postmodern capitalist success, right? And that is separated entirely from the issues of class, it's separated entirely from the issues of what constitutes grassroots transformative change. So if you get enough people from these backgrounds in the rooms from which the sort of shape and power structure of a nation is broadcast, then your business is done. Now, just very briefly to bring these two thoughts together, what happens with these sort of exclusions of certain definitions of what representation means is that you never really have that profound political change that you want to enact. Because without thinking through, without tying up the different strands of exclusion, either by sort of not excluding them altogether or including them but in a very restricted way, you tend to keep reproducing the same power structures. You tend to reproduce the same oppressive structures, and particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, the same authoritarian structures, because you have not fundamentally redefined or fundamentally reimagined what a representational democratic society looks like. And I'll leave it there for now.
So Kohei, if you could, your work, Nesrine has just talked about the different ways in which the global North and the global South think of questions of inequality from class to race to gender, and that these are, of course, interpreted very differently from South to North. But you've written one of the sites of inequality, one of the polycrises that you identify in your work is, of course, the climate disaster. Would you say that on the question of climate, where we've seen a mass mobilization all over the world, the North and the South, is that one issue on which movements transcend the kinds of differences that Nesrine correctly pointed out, certainly with respect to the Arab Spring, and all of them, in fact. But the climate movement seems somehow different. Would you agree with that?
Yes. However, under capitalism, it could go into the total opposite direction, which means that it can create the further worsening of inequality, leading to some kind of eco-fascism, because this excessive concentration of wealth, they are responsible for this existing climate disaster, but they have the means and money to externalize the costs of this disaster to someone else, somewhere else, in the global South mainly. So this means that we will have the accelerating class polarization in the coming ages. And this is, I think, really the reason why we need to challenge capitalism. It's not simply enough to go back to the golden age of capitalism. We are still told that all those problems, that crisis of democracy, crisis of planet, and all those kind of crises could be solved by growth. The further economic growth with further innovations could provide more jobs and more equality and so on and so on. But looking at the past, in the last 50 years or so, under the neoliberal reforms, we had austerity, we had a privatization, we have deregularization, and these are all the things that created only precarious jobs, low-paid jobs, and then worsening dependence on debt economy, and also creating this planetary crisis everywhere. And I think in this situation, it is not coincidental that many people are starting to question the legitimacy of capitalism. There's no way that it is possible to justify this absolute concentration of the wealth in the hands of the few when mass people are suffering. And this situation, especially in recent years, that elite seems to be totally comfortable with this mass suffering of the people in various ways under the climate disaster as well as the genocide. It really means that as long as their position and the interests are secured, they are fine with all those mess in this world. But it's not for many other people. And I think really that the climate movements are starting to challenge this injustice and this structure of the world that has been sustained for many, many years. And I think it's really time to talk about the new society that is not based on this kind of externalization, exploitation, expropriation of the wealth from other people.
Mm-hmm. So Ranjit, if you could, comment on what Kohei said in the context of your own work, invoking the Portuguese scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos's concept of insurgent cosmopolitanism, and explain what it means and how you think movements like the climate movement being just one, what kinds of oppositional and even transformational possibilities do such movements have, and in particular this idea of insurgent cosmopolitanism?
I think I came around to this set of thinkers. I'm thinking both of Boaventura's notion of insurgent cosmopolitanism, but also the political anthropologist James Holston's idea of the insurgent citizen. This comes out of many years of thinking about how we could retrieve a sense of optimistic, even activist internationalism by looking at how across societies and across histories we share certain predicaments of asymmetry, of injustice. And if I could just sketch out the particular journey that led me to this, it might shed some light on why these particular conceptions of collective action have been attractive to me. I think for me, a primal scene, if you will, of political anxiety in the Indian context has to do with the way in which we have had, since 1951, a liberal constitution that is based on principles of generosity, inclusiveness, making up for historical disadvantages, and which seeks to provide representation to vulnerable and disadvantaged communities and populations. But the reality, as we all know, increasingly so in this last decade, is that all of those guarantees are thrown into question by social and political constraints, retrogressive forces, and the kind of structural violence and injustice that results has particular implications for women, for indigenous communities, for religious minorities. So my focus really in the last 2 decades has been this particular scenario, the way in which these citizens who technically have guarantees, have those guarantees stripped away and negated by the way in which society actually operates, or the way in which the political system actively creates a sense of ressentiment among some communities and weaponizes that so that we don't really look at questions of lack and of deficit. So it seems to me, coming out of this very particular history, that we see the same kinds of things happening in other societies. And how might one then develop a certain form of resistance that isn't top-down but comes up from below? How might one look at the ways in which labor unions, for instance, have had to face the same kinds of asymmetries across societies, particularly in the global south? What can we learn from the feminist movements, whether in South Asia or in parts of Latin America? And how might this become a resource for wisdom, for knowledge, for action as we go ahead? And also this question of how indigenous communities across the world have had to combat much the same kinds of questions, the challenges of extractivism, and how have they opposed these questions. I think these questions, to me, are particularly key, because it's especially these communities or constituencies, if you will, that bear the brunt of what late capital has wrought upon the world. And to me, these are venues of learning and to see where we can go, what paths of redemption towards some kind of viable future we can actually assess out of all of this.
Mm-hmm. So Branko, to go back to you, I'd like you to comment on what Kohei said about the extent to which the very system under which we live and which large parts of the world have been made subordinate, namely neoliberal capitalism, the extent to which you think, because from what I understand, you're not entirely opposed to a capitalist system, though of course with many reforms, that the system is intrinsically, not just in the case of the climate crisis, able to externalize costs, that the system itself produces inequalities that become exponentially greater in every aspect of whatever, social, economic life. So
yes.
If...
Well, it's a difficult question. Let me try to sort of break it into different parts. I do agree with what you just said, but I sort of remember Schumpeter's definition of capitalism, that is a system that has to grow. It's an expansive system by its very definition, because if you have a system based on profit, that positive profit leads to investment, investment leads to growth. So I think there is a certain dynamic, and you cannot, actually that was Schumpeter's point, you cannot define stationary capitalism. It doesn't exist. It's an oxymoron. Now, on the concrete issue here, I'm a little bit in a sort of different camp, maybe because I'm an economist. But you know, I study global inequality. And when you study global inequality, and global inequality since 1990 is on the decline, why is it on the decline? It is because China and India have grown. Mm-hmm. Then you are in a paradoxical situation of somebody who is really very much committed to reduction of inequality, but who sees that the way to reduce global inequality is through growth. And then we have this problem of some people arguing for either stationary economy or degrowth. And then the obvious issue is, how are we going to solve world poverty? I mean, the problem with Africa is that it is not growing. Actually, I looked now, you know, before coming here, at growth rates. Africa in the last 50 years had less than 1% average growth rate on per capita basis annually. China had 7.7. India had 3.4. In other words, if you want to reduce poverty, if you want to include like inclusiveness in indigenous communities and all of that, if you have the envelope, which is the world GDP, where is the money going to come from? There are two possibilities, and I'll stop with that. One possibility, you have massive redistribution from the rich countries or rich people to the poor. But we are talking about massive stuff, and we are talking about 40% of GDP being redistributed. And you just don't have that. Nobody's going to do that. You know, people fight about $1. You know, here they fight like about 0.1% or 1% growth rate. I mean, are they going to give 40%? No. So that's one possibility. And the second possibility is really technological change, which would keep growth on, but would actually be much less detrimental or whatever to the nature and to the world and to ourselves. So I think we have to actually take these two things into account and to decide which one we want to go.
So Branko, I'll get Nesrine's comment on what you've said, but if you could explain, as you said, as an economist, why is it that Africa has had, as you cited, 1% growth over the last 50 years, and China at 8%, and India, of course, once it opened its economy in the 90s.
No, I don't know Africa well enough. I just sort of look at numbers. Let me give you another number. If you look at Africa and say, okay, what are the countries in Africa that had at least 5 years of growth at 5% consecutively? You actually find really tiny countries like, Equatorial Guinea because of oil and other countries like really small. The only large country is Ethiopia. And it grew for 13 years after the Civil War. So you really don't have, when you look at Asian countries in the last 50 years and African countries, it's a massive divergence, actually. Now, let me just say, economists were wrong on Asia. Myrdal wrote a book just before China and India started growing, called The Asian Drama, where he believed that Asia, because of high population growth, would not develop, and then, of course, they were all wrong. So many economists believe that Africa is in a really sort of a difficult situation, but we may be proven wrong. Africa has certain potentials, I think, particularly in digital innovations that could actually push Africa maybe in the service sectors ahead of the others. But to be quite honest, I don't know well enough Africa to answer your question directly.
But Nesrine, you've written a lot about, of course, specific places in Africa, starting with Sudan, but not only. If you could talk about the question of inequality, both within, to start with, Sudan, the different dimensions of it, and then respond to what Branko has said about the extent
why
of
Africa's not
growth.
growing. I can't comment on all Africa, but I can comment on a bit of it. And there's a cart before the horse situation here. And that the reason why in certain countries, which I'll refer to in Africa, where there is no growth, is because there has been no political model that has facilitated healthy economic growth and redistribution. If you take Egypt as an example, Egypt's assets, Egypt has a large industrial asset base, so it actually manufactures stuff. Morocco is the same. They manufacture things in the way that people would be quite surprised to hear. Morocco manufactures cars, and it even manufactures parts to be used in the aeronautical engineering sector in the US. So it's kind of has quite a sophisticated industrial base. Egypt is the same. It has not only, is coming back, tourism economy, but it has a large infrastructure and a country that's very, very closely connected between large towns. There's a very good supply chain between Europe through the Mediterranean to Egypt. The problem with Egypt is about 90% of those assets, everything from milk and dairy factories to production of hard parts for cars and manufacturing, is owned by about 2% of the population. And that 2% is concentrated not just in a class, it's concentrated in a sector, in the military sector and the patronage networks that surround it. There is an incredibly concentrated economy, which means that not only, this is a very crucial point, not only is wealth concentrated in small hands, decision-making about what happens to the economy and how it changes and how it grows is concentrated in those hands. So you get a misshapen economy, basically. That's one example. Kenya is another example. Sudan is another example, but I'll start with Kenya. Kenya is one of those countries that you said has a very strong digital and environmental program. So something like 90% of America's electricity is actually produced from wind and water. It's like one of the highest rates of natural energy in the world. It also has the largest system of digital money in the world, so like e-banks and e-wallets, etc. Kenya has a very large tourism industry that is run essentially by cartels within the country, about 7 families and their larger networks. And there's also a kind of complicated tribal structure in which when presidents come to power, they purge the previous president's cohort to bring in their own. So again, this sort of migrating series of economic interests across families and tribal interests. Sudan is my last example. I won't go on very long, don't worry. Sudan is my last example where you had about 60 years of a political model or economic model that was masquerading as a political model, where a very small number of ethnic and military elite groups centralized the economy, exploited the periphery, and basically swallowed the rest of the country through the capital, Khartoum. And that's why there's a war at the moment. So these are very complicated, long-running political concentrations of power that have not only prevented redistribution, but misshaped and distorted the economy in a way where economic growth doesn't even seem like a relevant metric anymore to try and divine how you can bring people out of inequality. The first question, the bigger metric, the most relevant one, is how can you change these systems of economic concentration to then even have the ability to structure an economy in a way that anyone has a chance. Forget the people who are fighting over, scraps on the margins, but to bring in even the middle classes into that picture. So I'm afraid it's a much more, if we're putting the economic cart before the political horse, is what I would say.
So Kohei, Nesrine has just said that economic growth is not the relevant metric. She's also just spoken about the concentration not only of wealth and the means of production, but also of decision-making in the hands of a few elites in specific countries in Africa. But of course, this is something that we see globally. But what you advocate is degrowth. So what is the...
Communism.
Yes, exactly. So explain, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that, the growth is not the solution. Growth is the problem of the current situation. And I totally agree with Branko's historical analysis. And I also quoted Schumpeter's remark that the stationary capitalism is actually adjecto contradictio. So it's like nonsense. And that's why I advocate for degrowth communism. We have to overcome capitalism somehow in order to achieve some kind of degrowth or stationary economy. And here is the problem. People say that why African people are poor. Then the answer is not enough capitalism, right? Then we need more growth. I don't really think so. If you bring this capitalism everywhere, what happened in many places? There are so many problems now. And even those green technologies are also highly consuming a lot of resources and energies. And simply replacing all those cars running outside with electric vehicles is not enough. They will also accelerate another new form of exploitation and expropriation of cheap labor and resources in the global south, and which will further divide the world between the global north and south, I would say. And the other problem is true. I don't deny the necessity of growth in poor countries, but is it really necessary for US, Japan, and China, India maybe, all those countries to grow further? And because we are struggling to grow only a little bit, and we investing so much energy and resources just for achieving, for what? Inventing new iPhone? That's just waste of our resources. We should use all those energy and resources to something more productive in Africa, for example. And the final problem is that, yes, China and India grew, and it solved many problems in those countries. But the problem is, it used to be the case that only rich people in the global north externalized social and environmental costs to somewhere else, including India and China. But now, India, China, and Brazil, and all those countries try to externalize their own costs somewhere else. But the Earth, our planet, is finite. So in the end, this way of living, which I call the imperial mode of living, our affluent life is based on the sacrifice of other people and the environment. This cannot be universalized. This is the status quo of capitalism in the history, but we reach to the point where this imperial mode of living, this externalization, cannot be sustained because it cannot be universalized. So I think it's really high time to talk about. I know that this sounds very ideal, utopian, to talk about degrowth and we share more, and that's why it's communism. You can say degrowth socialism if you prefer, but my point is basically, we really need to think something like that. Otherwise, I don't see really any convincing alternative to the existing crisis and this divide of global north and south, and it will rather get worse and worse, I'm afraid.
Ranjit, so India has been talked about a lot by Branko as well as Kohei now. So, India liberalized in the 1990s, and I remember, the transformation as it was evidenced in Hindi cinema, because it was such a huge change. Like in the 80s, there was like an angry young man who was almost always either a peasant or urban proletariat, right? And this is the person with whom the audience identified. He was the hero of the film. Suddenly, by the mid to late 1990s, all of these people had been completely erased. I mean, forget them being heroes. They simply ceased to exist in popular representations, media representations. So if you could say, and at the same time, of course, what Branko says is true, that there are much fewer people who are desperately poor in India, and also across the world, but at the same time, there are these massive differences, a massive inequality. We also just saw very recently in India this grotesque spectacle of Ambani's son's pre-wedding, where millions and millions of dollars were spent. And at the same time, of course, poverty does remain. So on the one hand, we have one of the richest men in the world spending tens of millions of dollars for his son's not even wedding or engagement, but just pre-wedding event. And at the same time, people are poor. And at the same time, many people are less poor than they were.
To begin with, the infamous shift in Bollywood's ideals. What you've annotated is essentially the rise of an aspirational society and its values in a certain way. But it's very, very clear from the rising discontent in society and what we see in terms of the state having withdrawn from healthcare, education, all forms of care that a post-colonial state in some ways was committed to. What we see actually is that the long-term result of this liberalization or opening up of the economy is that there is wealth, but all of that wealth is, sorry, this sounds like a very orthodox left-wing interpretation of what's happening, but it's been concentrated in exactly the kinds of elites that you spoke about, whilst more and more people are being left out of the possibility of doing better, leading better lives. And this is where I think that the question of inequality really gets weaponized, because the answer, as it comes to us from a state that's increasingly dominated by majoritarian right-wing forces, is not to address actual lack, material deficits, not to do anything about that, but to weaponize ressentiment, to give people the idea that they have suffered historical injustice or wrong, to present that, translate that in cultural terms, and to effectively turn some vulnerable communities against others. And to my mind, it's this horribly cynical way of playing out this kind of politics, which is going to be a key theme for us. I mean, we've already gone into our elections, And a number of these questions are already in play. People are beginning to look more critically at these questions. So I do not believe that we've become, as a whole, as a nation state, as a country, more prosperous. It's elite groups that have become far more prosperous. And I think we need to look at all those who've been left in the shadow, left out in the cold. And to my mind, that is the real metric to judge where we are on the question of inequality. How is it that, for instance, I have to say this is not we, but our particular parliament, it's gone through with a new set of legislations which seem to be transforming the colonial era forest laws, but actually have made them much worse in terms of allowing the state to actually have the right to destroy India's forest cover in the name of infrastructure projects. The same set of laws also disempower indigenous communities that have always had a symbiotic connection to the forests. They're being left out. They can be displaced at will. Effectively, they have been stripped of their rights. So I'm offering you a detail in what seems to me to be a process of institutional capture, really, that goes alongside this rise of a new class that is committed to extractivism, that does not share in the values that actually India was committed to for the first 50 or 60 years of its existence. So there's a drift away from even the pretense of a just society.
So Branko, if you could comment on this. I mean, Ranjit has just said this question of the withdrawal of the state, because it's not just in India that you witness that, it's a much broader phenomenon. The withdrawal of the state from even the most basic, its most basic functions, the provision, health, education, et cetera. We see it here in the earlier panel, people discuss that. So what do you see now as the role of the state in ensuring some modicum of equality when it seems, in fact, to be doing exactly the reverse?
No, I totally agree with what Rajiv said. Actually, India is a good example. I mentioned the growth rates of India, but of course, India had a massive increase of inequality. Now, as you know, the dispute, there is an Indian, what was it called, the Great Indian Poverty Debate, and there is, of course, huge dispute. You probably know that the new numbers by NSS had been just released, and that shows actually the significant decline in poverty. Now, whether it was the government that manipulated the numbers, it's also a possibility. But there was, of course, an increase in incomes, and I think probably, almost certainly, decline in poverty over the longer term, but a huge increase in inequality. But when it comes to the role of the state, it is clear of the government that it has been reduced throughout the world since the neoliberal revolutions. Actually, it has been going on since 1980. You know, some countries got in there later, but it is a trend. You know, when you look, for example, now, most recently, Millet, people underestimate him, but I don't think we should underestimate him. Millet is catching a certain trend, and he is an extreme case of this trend. And if you just look around here, the IMF is giving huge support to Millet. What do you call it, global north may be writing in the Guardian negative of Millet, but they are really supporting him. So, you know, because he was part of that neoliberal trend, and they recognize it in an extreme version of this trend. But they believe Argentina was an extreme version of the previous trend, so let's go to the other extreme now. And I really, currently, I'm totally logically in agreement with what you said, but I just don't see a political force in rich countries that would not only implement that would put on its program. Because if you put on your program that we want to have a stationary economy and no growth, nobody's going to vote for you. And I think that's the basic issue.
Nesrine, if you could, you know, just to go back to another point that Ranjit made, which you've also written about, this idea of, you know, these majoritarian right-wing governments that use different vectors of inequality, the things that you've written about, race, gender, et cetera, and then poverty, use these vulnerable communities somehow against one another. To what extent you've seen that you live in London, right? In
Yeah, well,
the
I live
UK.
in Nairobi, but London as well.
Okay, but you used to. How do you see that working? People spoke in particular about this, both in the context of Trump's election, but also in the context of Brexit.
Yeah.
If you could.
So you mean if there's a similar trend in the global south, or just comment on it in general?
No, how one sees this phenomenon playing out in the global north. It may well be, I mean, what Ranjit is referring to this happening in India, but it's also a phenomenon that one sees in rich countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue of, it's a scarcity manipulation, basically. So what happens, so in my research, and actually if you look at how the rhetoric around minorities, immigration, and general sort of race discourse over the past 10 years, but there's a longer history to it, obviously. And Pankaj Mishra actually wrote a very good book about this called Age of Anger, about how ressentiment has been a factor and a sort of element in political manipulation for years, is that whenever there is a desire to convert votes based on the premise of scarcity, then the conversation is never about the economy. It's not about how the economy is structured. It's not about how we can have new ideas about political reformulations of growth or of, taxation or public spending, et cetera. That is considered fixed. And coming back to your point, it's like that nobody's going to vote for you if you don't talk about the economy in a certain classic way. So who are the people, what are the factors that can be blamed that gives the voters a sense of agency, gives them a sense of control, and gives them a sense of possibility, right? If you tell your voters, you can't change the economy is a fact of nature. It just exists as it is. Capitalism is a fact of nature. Lack of regulation, the withdrawal from the state. This is a very common thing in the UK. Whenever there's questions about austerity in the UK, the answer always is, there's just no money. As if money is a real thing, as if there's an actual safety box which has all the money that is in the UK at the moment, and we have spent it all, as opposed to money being a function of government legislation, policy, inflationary decisions, etc. So if you're told that the economic system is set, fixed in stone, the only other vector that you have, as you say, is the number of people who participate in the economy and what their role is. And if you tell people that there's a set pie of a certain number of pieces, and other people, preferably not native, are going to steal your bit of the pie or shrink it, then actually that gives the voter a sense of agency, a sense of control. You can do something about this. That then extends to all forms of stigmatizing people as economic competitors, and they become rights competitors as well. So people of color are coming for your jobs via diversity initiatives. Women are getting paid more than men because they've been given these new policies of entitlement and sort of wage equalization, et cetera. So the language of scarcity extends not just from the kind of crude right-wing Trumpian approach about immigrants and illegals, but also about an entire rights infrastructure that is being eroded by people who are being given these rights because they're entitled purely because of their identity. Which means also it doesn't just come for your economic prosperity and your jobs, it comes for your actual credibility and place in the world and your status, and whether people will listen to you, whether you have authority. So it's not only corrosive in terms of kind of the political health of discourse, but it also means that it turns people against each other and people become naturally suspicious of any forms of redistribution, even the redistribution of language and the redistribution of respect and calling people certain things because they want to be called a certain thing, and even expands to the trans debate. And it creates a culture of scarcity across the board, not just economic, but even in terms of our language.
So, Kohei, Nesrine has just addressed a number of issues having to do with, the kind of populism that we've seen in different places. Now, this idea of degrowth, in addition to addressing economic inequality, the climate crisis, you also see it as somehow addressing this crisis of right-wing populism, which is manifesting in all kinds of different places. Could you explain how exactly that works and how you see popular movements, if you do at all, mobilizing in that direction?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's easy to denounce kind of right-wing populism as, stupid and manipulating, and, all those people are just full of resentment and so on. But I think it sounds quite kind of arrogant, I mean, we understand better. So these are stupid people, but we know what's right and so on. I don't think that kind of way of talking doesn't work. And I totally understand that, arguing for degrowth, communism, or whatsoever is totally unrealistic. But at the same time, only talking about what is realistic is really the reason why people got so dissatisfied with the establishment, and the liberal is losing everywhere, right? So it's just talking about democracy, equality, human rights, when so many people are actually dying in this world. It just makes nonsense. So I think it's really kind of important to emphasize, it's really important to emphasize a new kind of left populism, I would even say. It's really, we need to face the seriousness of the poly-crisis, and then really challenging what used to be quite conventional and common sense. Otherwise, our narratives lose its kind of a conviction. And I think it's still, I admit totally that the problem we are facing is really hard. It's not easy. But in the US, I want to come up with this example. I mean, dismantling chattel slavery, the slavery system, costed civil war in the US. It's really hard. Then, because slavery was an important capital, capitalism without slavery system couldn't have so easily develop. But today, the role of slavery is basically replaced by fossil fuel, the fossil capital. Dismantling fossil capital requires maybe something like civil war today again. So it's not easy thing. It's not an easy transformation. It's not like, we protect the planet and then everyone will change our mind. No, it's really, the capitalism is dependent on fossil capital, and it's not so easy that they will simply give up. So, I mean, that's not very optimistic answer, but at the same time, it's not simply enough to emphasize those good words, I would say. And it's really, we are more in the moment of danger and crisis and war.
So Ranjit, before we turn, we've got some excellent student questions here. If you could just respond to what Kohei said about, the kind of arrogance of, I guess, people like us who say that we know, this right-wing populism, and Modi is, of course, an instance that we know better, the people who support him don't actually know anything, we're the knowledge bearers, they're kind of ignorant, acolytes or whatever. How do you respond to that?
I actually wouldn't dismiss people who get swayed by right-wing populists. It's not that we're being arrogant. I think the actual attitude should also be one of humility. It's obvious that the systems that we've stood for have not included many of these people. And that the sense of exclusion and lack on their part is real. Mm-hmm. That's not fictional. And we've not addressed it in certain ways. So how might we address that? What are the forms of dialogue that we need to? Which is why, for me, ressentiment is not something that I believe is in some way implicit in these people. It's a function of how lack can be weaponized and turned into this sense of deep injury or historical wrong. So I think we need to address these questions. I also think we need to look at this meso-realm, if you will, between what the state can offer and your sense of lack. What is it that, in Holston's term, makes you an insurgent citizen? What are the forms of assembly? What are the kinds of arrangements that we can improvise amongst ourselves? I think these are questions that we need to attend to, and I think this will come up during this week. The question of, rather than simply depend on the state to be the bearer of transformation, what is it that we ourselves can do? This might well sound utopian, but it is going to be a time of conflict and of utopian questions and of seeking out these solutions for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start these student questions, which are actually extremely good questions. One that, in the earlier panel, we talked about, it's very hard to miss, all the student activism on campuses and the protests with respect to US policy on Gaza and American universities, investments in Israel. There's a question about what role you think student-led organizations or movements can play in advocating for and helping to implement social change, not just on campus, but well beyond. Branko, if you'd like to begin.
I will be very brief, actually. I'm probably the only one here who remembers 1960s, so, it did actually make a change, and I wrote a blog about it. I started really thinking, and of course many people have thought, what was the change that they did? How should I say, and actually I was there then in a socialist country, Yugoslavia, which had a student movement, which was the leftist movement against market economies in socialist countries. So it was a kind of interesting movement. And obviously, I think that it did produce a change in social mores, norms, way we address each other, and actually I think it democratized Western societies significantly. On the other hand, as later people have said, it did open the doors to neoliberal policies, and it was actually a movement and it's not surprising that people who were, on the left and leaders, and later the Green movement and all of that, became very neoliberal. So there were these two aspects of that movement. So that was about the past. About the present, I really don't know, but looking at the past, I can see that these movements can be, how should I say, the spark that would lead to societal change. I don't think that would lead to dramatic political change because they are not parties, but they could lead to change in social opinions, mores, issues, and so on, the way that, as I said before, that we see the world. So I'm not pessimistic about student movements. They start as small as they did start in the 1960s. They can actually become much larger.
Mm-hmm. So Nesrine, if you could also say something about that, the role that students can play in advocating for social change and greater equality, and then just to combine that with another question, which is about how your background has influenced your view on the ways in which to resolve inequality.
So in answer to the first question, I think there's sometimes a concern, especially in moments like this, that it's not enough. Just protesting is not enough, or making a fuss is not enough because the media cycle moves on very quickly, so people become quite impatient, especially young people, to effect some very dramatic change in policy. And actually, particularly when it comes to the Gaza issue, but this applies across the board when it comes to shifting the sort of red lines in politics, is that the discursive level is in a way more important than the political level. The political level is temporary. People in power are temporary. Certain regimes are temporary. The discursive level, the kind of, like you say, the mores, the values, what becomes conventional wisdom is actually a far more important, far more crucial battling ground than who's in the White House, whether Trump wins, or whether even in the next 5-10 years, Israel policy changes in the UK, Europe, or the US. So that's the first thing, the sort of the infrastructure or the scaffolding for politics is more important than the actual politics. And that takes time, but actually in the long run is more crucial. So it's sort of, I'd like people to think of something they do today as not decisive in the short term, but definitive in the long, or even in the medium term. And so the trick is just to stay consistent, just to keep it up. At whatever level, whatever tenor it is, as long as it's consistent, and then it becomes part of the sort of detail and mosaic of everyday life. It permeates your values, it permeates how you spend your money, what jobs you take, how you socialize. When it becomes as elemental and definitive to your life as any other fundamental principle, then compounded, that has a very big impact. And then suddenly, it will feel quite decisive. So that's my answer to the first question. Do you remember what the second question was?
Background.
How that has influenced my approach to
inequality, how you think inequality can be resolved.
So just to give a brief, potted, boring history of my background. So I'm from Sudan, and I grew up in so the answer is yes, it has influenced it. I grew up in a very conservative society, Muslim, sub-Saharan African society, and came to the UK or the West when I was in my mid-20s. So I spent my entire life in North Africa and the Middle East. And what I saw as very specific modes of inequality, very specific, culturally particular modes of inequality, particularly gender inequality, really formed my anger and my I became very politicized because I felt like something needed to change in my own country, my own society, even in my own family. And the West was this sort of shiny, sparkling space that I'd only ever consumed or come in contact with via Hollywood, which is very powerful, and via my sort of normally Western education. So I was really a product of propaganda in my mid-20s. And I came to the UK, and the first thing that struck me was that these things that had formed my political motivations that I thought were incredibly specific to Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, were in fact common and reproduced, but just with a twist, with one chromosomal difference in the West. And then I began to see how people are excluded, othered, minoritized, dehumanized, and devalued in ways that are very similar across the board, in ways that are at the same time quite worrying, because you think this is something that is deep-seated in humanity wherever we are, that we try and create tribes and hierarchies and pyramids of rights, but also simultaneously quite comforting, because you think, oh, but we're all quite similar in that respect. And if you find the solution for one place or a template for one, you basically cracked it for all. So that's my answer.
So Kohei, what about you? You grew up in Japan, this place that grew so exponentially economically. How is it that your biography, just to respond to the same question that this student asked, how did your background come to influence this? How did you come to the idea of degrowth from your own biography?
By reading Das Kapital. Just kidding, but yeah. No, I was. No, seriously. For the first question, that students easily get kind of disappointed after a couple months or a couple years because they try so hard, but nothing seems to have been achieved. And then I'm always saying. Young activists in Japan that because socialists have been defeated for almost 200 years, so we know a lot of defeats, but they have been fighting for many years, and then I think there are many achievements, right? Universal suffrages and banning child labors, and we also established many social welfares and so on. And these are the things that are again dismantled because of non-existence of opposition anymore. And when I entered college, 2005, there was no interest in socialism anymore. And I didn't expect that my book on degrowth communism would sell 500,000 copies after 20 years.
How do you explain that? Why do you think it did?
Because I think people now recognize that or people now start looking for alternatives. They are really dissatisfied with this economic stagnation in Japan, and then they tried, Japanese government tried so hard to increase the economic growth, but then various reforms, it just failed, and we have many problems. And then, so now maybe it's high time to think about accept this destiny of non-growing, the stationary state, and then under capitalism, this non-growth is recession. It's bad for everyone because everything is designed based on the assumption of continuous growth. But then when the reality is no longer growing, I think it's necessary to rearrange the institutions and the system. And that is why I think people are sort of accepting this kind of fate, and then they're looking for alternative. And so I didn't expect 20 years ago that I can speak about socialism on TV in Japan. And that's changing. And the same thing as actually my colleague, he's a climate scientist. He told me the same thing 30 years ago when he was a PhD student. He wouldn't expect that this climate crisis or climate change would be a social issue. He knew at the time already that's very serious, but no one was talking. No politician, no CEOs, and no one was talking. So he was just like, maybe just humans would go extinct. But after 30 years, there are a lot of progresses. Not enough, of course, not enough. We want more, but at the same time, 20, 30 years, there's so many changes. And the young people don't know yet because they are only 20 years old. But I'm telling them, they can work hard and they will bring changes, and they are the ones who will really create new world.
Mm-hmm. So, Ranjit, if you could also, this related topic is which of these issues, Kohei just mentioned how people were shocked that his book talking about socialism, we're talking about the climate catastrophe, now has become such a huge issue in Japan, totally unexpected. So which of these, this is a question from the audience, which of these different issues, whether it's the economy, whether it's gender, climate, race, which one of these issues do you think is the most amenable to a global solidarity movement, apart from the ones that we already see, apart from what do you think has the possibility of bringing the most people together across national boundaries?
Frankly, the challenge is, we used this word polycrisis in preparation for this session, although I'm not sure it came up actually in our discussions. The fact is it's not possible to segregate these themes or these problems. They are so closely bound up with one another. Mm-hmm. So I think even before we contemplate how we achieve this global solidarity, I think we all need to recognize that whilst we might have special and even specialist interests in one or another of these areas, we need to see them as part of a much larger crisis that is upon us. So there's no way to pull them. I think we actually would find grounds for transnational solidarity if we began by recognizing that. We live in the world of the butterfly effect. And we need to recognize that something that looks like a problem of disenfranchisement of women also has a dimension that is very, very closely bound up with climate crisis. I'm thinking here of the hills of Uttarakhand, for instance, in northern India. If you look back to the 1970s, I'm just going to offer this as a brief example. There was a very, very celebrated environmental activist campaign in the hills of Uttarakhand in the 1970s. It was actually led by women, the women of those villages. In course of time, that narrative has been completely taken over, and the momentum and motivation has been attributed to, no surprise here, to sage-like male leaders who played some kind of pivotal role eventually in taking it to the level of, dialogue with policymakers. But the fact is that it emerged from the bottom up, from the women of these villages in the hills. The Chipko Andolan is what I'm thinking of here. Mm-hmm. So, this is not even from our times. It comes from the 1970s. But I offer that as a detail of how these questions are so closely tied up. Mm-hmm. So we need to accept this as a kaleidoscopic set of challenges.
So Branko, do you agree with that, that there's this what we call intersectionality, that all of these issues kind of intersect, and there's no way of dealing with one above or more than the other? And then an additional question from the audience, which is, why should people care about global inequality when national or local inequality is such a massive and immediate issue for so many?
Okay, let me try to answer the first question first, because to this question, if you had asked me that about 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been much more optimistic that there was some possibility of finding some common language, or what was called universalism in the previous session and so on. But now we did not, in the background behind us is de facto 3 wars. So we cannot disregard them. And if you look at the war in Europe, it's a very old-fashioned war, which actually happened in practically many, actually all, 2 communist federations. It's a war for land. It's like as old as possible. I want this land, and the other guy wants this land, and we fight about it. Then we have also war for land and survival in Gaza. And then we have a war which is on the horizon between the US and China. And then you say, like, how can we speak about universal values when we don't have any value in international relations? Nothing is respected. And so that's why I'm saying if you had asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been more optimistic. But I see this huge elephant in the room, and I just cannot see how we can have anything anymore in common where we have such disagreements on absolutely war and peace. So that was, my first point. Secondly, on the second question, yeah, I totally agree. I get this question very often. Indeed, individuals do not relate to global inequality, but in many ways, global inequality affects you because your position in the world depends very often on what is your global position. There are many people like in rich countries who have reacted when we talked about populism to the decline in their relative position in the world. And we now have, for the first time in 200 years, since we have some kind of data, we have, you mentioned that before, we had actually now many more people from Asian countries in the top, either 5% or 10%. It is a dramatic change because the West plus Japan have been really sort of only their people were there. Even like poorest people, still is the case. Poorest people from Denmark are at the 85th percentile of the world. Everybody here is, we are all in the top 5% in the world. They're actually probably even in top 1 or 2%. So we have to realize that. And when we speak about top 1%, we have to be quite clear. Do we speak about top 1% in the US, or we speak about global top 1%, of which US is actually 11% of the Americans are there. So, I think it does actually, to quote Trotsky, maybe you don't want to have, maybe you're not interested in a war, but the war is interested in you. So, maybe you're not interested in global inequality, but global inequality is interested in you.
Nesrine, your take on that. Why should people be bothered?
It comes back to what I was saying at the start, which is you cannot separate. If you want, this is kind of a point that is not addressed abstractly to the room, but specifically to organizing forces on the left, is if you separate disparate rights demands, right, gender equality, racial equality, class equality, etc., from your fundamental political program, right, which tend to be big political and economic questions, then what you're doing is you're sowing the seeds for your own demise at some point. You're basically keeping the seat warm for the right. Because what you're doing is not changing the fundamental structure of what we associate in our heads with a prosperous economic political regime under the left, right? So one thing that has been really informative, and I'm a little bit evangelical about this now, is that since post-Black Lives Matter, which felt like a really crucial, historical, pivotal moment where people really began to understand that there was this huge racial minority that was excluded. there was such a backlash to it, and the way that it became incorporated into our political system and our value system is that it became about diversity and representation. Even though the original demands were much more radical than that. It was about carceral regimes, it was about voter registration, it was about maternal health, it was about female inclusion in academic enterprises. It was about public transport. That's like one of the roots of Black Lives Matter in the US was in the public transport system in Los Angeles, because people of color were not being able to get to jobs downtown because there was really no public transport system. And so these very grassroots fundamental questions that would have where addressing them would have changed people's lives materially, not necessarily to get them into the boardroom of a FTSE 500 company or into a political party or into a position of power, into a sort of cabinet position, but it would have made their lives materially better. Those questions became overwhelmed and replaced by questions of visibility, right? Of who is in the room that is powerful. Who can you point to and say, this person's in the room, therefore we are doing fine. And the danger of these separations is you can't get away with them for long. They can extend your legitimacy and your credibility for a little bit, but people eventually see through them. And the Biden administration, which began, I don't know if anybody recalls now, but the Biden administration began with this huge promise of becoming the most diverse administration in history. I don't think anyone remembers that now, because there were all these people in big positions in the White House that were from, there was a kind of, it was a sort of reverse scramble for Africa, where they basically put down the map of the US administration and handed it out to different minorities to make it seem like this was a sort of new beginning. Has that pulled any levers in any direction in the Biden administration that make people think that this was a materially, fundamentally transformative administration for people of color? Absolutely not. And actually, it's ending, ironically, in a note of exclusion after the Gaza war and Arab Americans and generally sort of a broader coalition of people of color feeling completely excluded from the agenda. So just to wrap it up, it is to include all, to make your politics truly intersectional is not a kind of fancy ideal. It's not an unrealistic thing that people are promoting or demanding because it sounds nice. It's because it's good for you. It's actually strategically the clever thing to do, because what it does is it makes your politics expansive and inclusive and ground roots enough that when there is a challenge to it, it can't be easily unseated by populist sort of referrals to immigrants or scarcity of capital jobs, et cetera. So that's what we're constantly trying to, it's a pitch to the kind of the left in the UK, is that all these things are not just decorative, they're actually existential.
And Kohei, there's a question that's specific to you, related in part to this, which is, how can you address inequality if you embrace degrowth? Where does the money to address inequality come from without growth?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that's the same thing. You know, growth is necessary for the sake of overcoming poverty, but not necessarily. We have enough resources and, you know, everything.
So you're saying redistribution?
Redistribution could be a one way, but not like redistribution. Taxing a little bit more is not enough, right? I mean, it's literally, we also have to fundamentally challenge the way how we live, especially in the global north, because this is not simply inequality of money. It is really resources, energies, and food, and this long history of colonialism and imperialism is very severe. And if you only care about your own nation, you get the wrong answer to this planetary problem. Climate crisis is planetary, and if you only care about the US, and if you advocate for Green New Deal and green growth in the US, better job for workers, economic growth, and so on, you end up exploiting and expropriating so much wealth from somewhere else and externalizing all the costs to the global south, but only increasing the divide between US, China, whatsoever, and then that only leading to the another, more serious global problem, and also the decarbonization would not be possible either. And one more final thing is basically, like I said, that this ruling establishment, ruling class is indifferent to mass sufferings and the genocide, and this is a proof that they don't care about you as long as their positions are secured, interests are secured. So that means, it's an example during the COVID. So many people died in the US, but elites, establishment, they could just work at home and they don't care. And the same thing would happen again in the climate disasters. Poor people will be affected, but the rich people are fine. And then the war between China and the US, only the poor people will go to war. And so if we leave the suffering and the problem of human rights and peace and everything, if we don't pay enough attention, because it's happening now somewhere far away in Ukraine or Gaza, then that's gonna come to your own country one day. It's gonna come to Japan, it's gonna come to US. So I think it's really necessary to now pay attention to all those problems and sufferings happening in Gaza and Ukraine, so that we will not also experience the same problem in the near future.
And Ranjit, there's a question that's also specifically addressed to you, which is that how do you explain, and I guess one can look at it in the context of India, but also more broadly, how do you explain the extent of inequality in our society, social, racial, gender, et cetera, when the idea of equality is so prevalent and often anchored, as you mentioned, in constitutions themselves? And India was, as you said.
Let's take India as an example then. I think it's really a contradiction between a very optimistic, even to some extent a utopian constitution, which genuinely was premised on these values of equality, inclusiveness, and so on, over against which there is a society that has been very slow to change in certain ways. It has preserved feudal structures. It also has internalized the asymmetries of the colonial period. And that's the fundamental contradiction. For many decades, there was a productive, I'm going to call it a dialogue, which is really a polite word for it, between these two poles, if you will. That's increasingly collapsed, I think. So, which is why, whilst we might in theory have a constitution committed to equality, the conditions on the ground are, they militate against it. I keep thinking back now to something that Dr. Ambedkar said. He was the key author of India's constitution, and himself belonged to a caste formerly known as untouchable. He came from really the bottom of society. He went on to become one of the most highly educated Indians of his generation. He was at Columbia, he was at the London School of Economics, Inns of Court, all of this, which gave him this incredible perspective. And at some point when he addressed, as he was presenting the Constitution, he said that democracy will always be a fragile topsoil on an earth that is fundamentally undemocratic. And this was, you can take that to mean either a profound pessimism about the future of a constitutionalist India, or you can see that that's really the challenge. What do you do with this earth? How do you transform this situation? Yeah. So that's that's my response to this. I think we should see this as a constant call to rededicate ourselves to ensuring that we don't lose sight of those constitutional values.
And on that note of a constitution, what did you call it? A call, a universal call?
A call to rededication.
A call to rededication. We come to the end of this session. I want to thank all of you, Branko, Nesrine, Kohei, and Ranjit, and of course all of you for attending. Thank you.